What if one accidental kiss could change the fate of an entire galaxy? He was just a cargo pilot lost in the background of interstellar politics. She was an alien princess, buried under rubble in a terrorist attack. But when Chris Winters chose to save her, he unknowingly awakened a ritual that would bind him to 7 powerful alien sisters and link his soul to a cosmic device that could either heal millions, or collapse reality itself. How do you survive being genetically engineered for a destiny you didn't ask for? What happens when love, power, and emotion become weapons in a war not fought with guns but with empathy? This is the legend of the Heart Emperor. But the real question is, would you choose to become more than human, if it meant giving up everything that made you one? The atmosphere on Lorizian always felt too thick for a man like Chris Winters. Not because of the planet's strange humidity or its violet-hued skies, but because it always pressed into his mind like a fog, an emotional pressure he could never quite shake. Even the light felt heavier here, bleeding down from the crystalline domes of the spaceport and casting surreal purples and silvers across the floor, as if the planet itself were trying to reach inside him. Chris adjusted the collar of his standard cargo uniform and stepped down from the reliable disappointment, his freighter and only constant companion. The name had started as a joke, something his ex muttered during their last argument, but over time, he claimed it with pride. A reflection of his life, reliable, if unremarkable. Just another human pilot delivering crates of whiskey and medical supplies to a system that barely remembered Earth was part of the Galactic Council. He handed his manifest to a violet-skinned customs official with eyes too bored to care and fingers too swift to miss a lie. Earth whiskey, Chris muttered, gesturing to his cargo log, and some farming tech. Nothing fancy. But even as he joked, he kept his emotion-dampening gloves tightly on. The Lorizian gift of emotional transference was no joke. It slipped into you through touch like heat, subtle and invasive. Once, a handshake with a merchant left Chris sobbing for a home he'd never been to. That kind of emotional intimacy scared him more than pirates. The official waved him through with barely a glance. Diplomatic summit today. Try not to offend anyone important. Chris nodded and shouldered his bag, muttering under his breath, "That's always the goal." But the spaceport was different this time, too crowded, too vibrant. Delegates from across the quadrant passed in tight clusters, speaking a cacophony of languages through auto-translators that buzzed like insects. His instincts, honed by years of navigating backwater trade routes and nearly being spaced by smugglers, tingled. Something was wrong. His eyes caught a movement too precise to be casual, a maintenance worker planting a small device near a support beam, their wrist pulsing with a concealed tracker. Chris froze. Time warped. The moment stretched, then he moved. "Hey." His voice echoed like a gunshot across the concourse. The worker looked up, startled, then bolted. Chris never got the chance to chase him. The explosion shattered the air. A wave of fire and sound hurled him against a pillar. Smoke filled his lungs, and alarms screamed. He could barely hear anything but the ringing in his ears and the sound of people screaming guttural, panicked, unfiltered fear. His training took over: cover, assess, move. But before he could orient himself, he saw her. Pinned beneath a fallen column, violet skin streaked with soot and blood, was a woman. Young. Fragile looking. But it was her eyes, silver like moonlight trapped in a storm, that locked his attention. He didn't think. He ran. The debris pinning her down looked heavy, but not fatal. He dropped beside her and spoke in a calm, practiced tone. "I'm going to lift. When I do, you pull. Got it?" She nodded, wincing as tears carved lines through the ash on her cheeks. Her voice was soft but steady. "Please, help me." Her translator pendant blinked dimly on her collar. He heaved. The beam groaned as he forced it upward with every ounce of strength. Muscles burned. Sweat poured. But it moved just enough for her to crawl free, leaving behind a streak of darker blood. She collapsed into his arms, trembling. More explosions followed. The spaceport ceiling cracked like glass, sending fragments tumbling like falling stars. He pulled her behind the shattered remains of a vending terminal. Her leg was torn badly, and blood soaked through his jacket as he pressed it to the wound. She clung to him, her hand touching his arm, and that's when he felt it. Not her fingers. Her fear. Raw and deep, a surge of terror that wasn't his but poured into his chest like cold water. She was a Lorizian. One with high sensitivity. Her emotions seeped through his barriers and into his nervous system like a psychic flood. And yet, he didn't recoil. He held her tighter. "We have to move," he said. "Can you walk?" She tried, collapsed. "No." So he lifted her. One arm beneath her legs, one around her shoulders. She was light, almost impossibly so. "Hold on," he whispered, stepping into the chaos again. They moved through fire and screams, shadows of attackers flashing in the smoke, security bots firing back with energy pulses that cut the air like lightning. The smell of ozone and melting plastic filled his nose. She whispered her name, Lyra Elvenile, and something inside Chris stuttered. He had heard that name before. House Elvenile. One of the ruling bloodlines of Lorizian. Highborn. Untouchable. And here she was, bleeding in his arms. They reached a side corridor. It was quieter there, filled only with dust and flickering emergency lights. He laid her down on a bench, and she touched his cheek. Her fingers were cold, but they pulsed with something deeper intention, resonance, feeling. "I sensed your heart," she said, her voice a whisper laced with awe. "When you lifted that beam. You weren't afraid." Chris exhaled, laughing bitterly. "Oh, I was terrified. But I've learned fear doesn't get to be in charge when someone's counting on you." Then she kissed him. Not a passionate kiss. Not a romantic one. But a kiss of ritual, of something ancient and utterly irreversible. In that second, time twisted. Chris felt something inside him shift, his nervous system lighting up like a neural constellation, every point of contact with her forming a bond that defied language or logic. And though he didn't know it yet, in that fleeting moment of lips meeting lips, he had just triggered the most sacred and binding covenant in the Lorizian tradition. The soul union of the Seven Sisters. Help arrived in a storm of white robes and glowing stretchers. Medics whisked Lyra away, but not before she whispered one last sentence that etched itself into Chris's mind: "Life debts must be paid through the soul." He didn't understand what she meant. But the High Court of Ritual Bonds would explain soon enough. Chris Winters hadn't expected to stay on Lorizian. After the explosion and the emergency rescue, he thought things would return to normal. A few official questions, a vague thank you from some planetary authority, and then back to hauling crates through the void in his rust bucket freighter. But Lorizian operated under laws that belonged to no federation he'd ever known, and what he thought was a fleeting kiss born of panic and empathy, had triggered something ancient. Irreversible. At dawn, two towering Lorizian envoys clad in ceremonial stone-gray robes appeared at his temporary quarters. Their voices were smooth, resonant, almost detached. "Christopher Winters," one said. "You have been summoned to appear before the High Court of Ritual Bonds." "Summoned by who?" Chris asked groggily, wiping sleep from his eyes. The official document handed to him shimmered with an embedded translator, the alien symbols rearranging themselves into English. But one phrase jumped out and punched him in the gut. By virtue of the kiss exchanged with Lyra Elvenile, you are now under binding ritual obligation to house Elvenile. Section 17 PRX. The union is collective. He laughed, incredulous. This has to be a joke. It was not. The city around him glittered like a dream, its crystalline bridges arching between towers that looked like frozen storms, spiraling toward the lavender sky. Under different circumstances, Chris might have found it beautiful. But he was being escorted like a prisoner, or worse, a groom at a wedding he hadn't proposed to. When they reached the spiral sanctuary, part courtroom, part cathedral, he was led inside a chamber so vast and silent it made time feel optional. 7 elders sat motionless on raised crystalline platforms, their skin dark purple like the oldest stones at the bottom of the sea. In the center of the chamber, a floating hologram rotated in slow, damning circles, the moment Lyra had kissed Chris in the smoke-filled corridor, recorded in perfect detail from every angle. Chris tried to explain, his voice dry. I didn't know. I was helping someone. That kiss, it wasn't planned. Where I come from, we call that kindness. Not legal entanglement. The central elder raised a single hand, silencing the room with one motion. Intent does not alter the binding. Action defines reality. Chris stood frozen. His fate had just been sealed by a custom he didn't understand, performed in a language of skin and soul. A side door opened. 7 women entered, each with presence, each different yet together, they created a sense of cosmic symmetry. Their violet skin reflected the chamber's light like starlight on still water. Their eyes, their stance, their energy, each one was a force. Chris's stomach twisted. These were the 7 sisters of House Elvenile. One stepped forward. Her short-cut hair and sharp, military uniform made her seem carved from wool itself. Celestia. Let's be clear, Earthman, she said, voice clipped like a blade. We didn't choose you. But the law binds you to us all. You kissed one, you bonded with all. Chris's gaze darted to the back of the group. Lyra stood quietly, her silver eyes carrying both apology and hope. She looked different now, no longer the injured girl beneath rubble, but a princess caught in the gears of something larger than either of them. Chris lifted his hands in disbelief. I'm just a cargo pilot. I didn't ask for this. I don't want to be a bondmaid, or emperor, or whatever you think I am. But the silence that followed wasn't one of shock or insult. It was the silence of beings who had seen destiny before, and recognized it when it arrived bleeding in a corridor. The heart device, said another sister, Verilia, graceful and dangerous, her gaze calculating. It only activates through the unified resonance of our 7 souls channeled through one bondmate. No bond, no device. Chris's mind reeled. This wasn't a marriage. This wasn't even a relationship. This was the key to a godlike machine, the ancient heart device which could sway the balance of entire star systems. And only a single being could complete its circuit, the one who had shared the accidental kiss. Him. Not because of love. Not because of merit. Because he happened to lift a beam and carry a girl to safety, and because that girl had kissed him to say thank you. Celestia stepped closer, her voice iron. You are no longer just a man. You are the intersection of 7 souls, and a world. Chris didn't reply. Because he understood, finally, what was happening. He wasn't standing in a courtroom. He was standing at the edge of a myth. A myth that had already chosen him, before he ever knew there was a choice to be made. He was no longer his own. The Elven Isle estate was not just a palace, it was a living memory, carved into crystal, suspended above oceans that never slept. Each hallway seemed to whisper echoes of decisions made centuries ago. Within this sacred geometry, Chris Winter's former cargo pilot, accidental bondmate, was now a necessary presence. Not a guest. Not even a prisoner. Something else. Something harder to define. He was told that the heart device, the ancient construct hidden deep within the palace's core, could only be awakened by one who had formed genuine harmony with all 7 daughters of House Elven Isle. And so, they began the harmony sessions. Each sister embodied a psychological resonance. They were not merely women. They were archetypes made flesh, vessels of emotion, discipline, intuition, and history. And one by one, Chris had to face them not with words or logic, but by learning their language, the language of feeling. Lyra was first. The empathy. The one who had kissed him in desperation but reached into something deeper than crisis. She met him in the crystal garden's fields of towering structures that shimmered with pale light, pulsing in rhythm with the emotions of those nearby. She wore white, but not ceremonial white, rather, a soft, woven garment that seemed designed to invite vulnerability. She didn't begin with questions. She began with touch. Her fingers laced through his, and the pulse of her feelings flowed into him, not overpowering, but curious, reflective, and full of delicate hope. "Feel where you end," she whispered, "and I begin. That space in between, that's where harmony lives." Chris had always lived with barriers, emotional armor forged in loneliness and loss. But here, he learned to open, carefully, deliberately. At first, he could barely tell where his guilt ended and her compassion began. But with practice, with breath, with stillness, he began to distinguish them, then reflect them back. He sent her gratitude, and the crystals around them shimmered gold. She wept not because she was sad, but because she was seen. And in that moment, Chris understood what empathy felt like when it wasn't just a word but a bridge. But Lyra was only the beginning. Celestia was next. She summoned him to the hangar bay, where the royal interceptors slept like sleeping dragons. "Harmony with me isn't about holding hands," she said coldly. "It's about trust under fire." She strapped him into the co-pilot seat and launched the craft skyward at speeds that blurred the city below into lines of light. The session became a trial. At first, she mocked his hesitation. His flying style was too cautious, too predictable. "You fly like you're afraid of waking the stars," she said. But when enemy ships ambushed them in orbit, rogue scouts testing the estate's perimeter, Celestia didn't hesitate. She flipped the ship mid-burn, handed Chris the auxiliary controls, and demanded, "Show me you're more than just a soul ornament." What followed was chaos. They plummeted into a debris field, twisted remnants of a forgotten battle, and weaved between broken hulls at breakneck speed. Chris guided the craft like a man who'd never been trained but had survived more than most. At one critical moment, a fractured warship loomed ahead. "We can't clear that," he said. "We don't clear it," Celestia replied. "We fold around it." And then she did. A maneuver so precise it seemed like teleportation, flipping, rotating, and reaccelerating in a single blur of movement. They survived. Barely. Afterward, drenched in sweat and adrenaline, Celestia looked at him for the first time without contempt. "I still don't like you," she said. "But now I respect you." Harmony earned not through sentiment but through shared survival. Then came Inari, the scientist. Their session took place not in open sky or glowing gardens, but in a sterile chamber pulsing with lights and data streams. She didn't touch him. She scanned him. Probed him. Not just physically but intellectually. Emotion is not magic, she said. It's pattern. Language. Frequency. Chris didn't understand most of what she said at first. Neural resonance. Cross-species signal drift. But slowly, with patience, he began to see what she meant. She taught him how to filter feelings like radio waves, how to distinguish sorrow from memory, excitement from fear. But more than that, she showed him the blueprint of the heart device. It reacts to the emotional frequency between us, she explained. If it resonates cleanly across all 7 patterns, it activates. She paused, looking at him with something more than clinical interest. So far, you're showing high compatibility. Too high. What does that mean? It means, she said slowly, you may not have been chosen accidentally. Her gaze lingered long enough to suggest suspicion, or something else. With Verelia, diplomacy became seduction. She didn't meet him in gardens or labs but in the negotiation chambers, during actual trade disputes between Lorizian and the Hegemony. He was supposed to observe. Instead, he intervened. Where Verelia used nuance, Chris used earth bluntness. Both sides want power and peace. Fine. Trade routes bring profit. So share them. Fight later. There was silence. Then laughter. Then agreement. Afterward, Verelia pulled him aside, eyes sharp. That was reckless. But it worked. Yes, she said, stepping closer. Perhaps you're more useful than you appear. Her touch on his arm sent a pulse of appreciation so deliberate it made his breath catch. But her emotions were layered: gratitude, intrigue, and an undercurrent of something darker, harder to name. Verelia was not easily moved. But Chris had done something none of the sisters expected, he'd shifted their balance. By midday, 3 more sisters remained. Tyr, the analyst who watched instead of spoke. Serena, the performer who turned emotion into art. Mayuri, the eldest, who refused even to acknowledge him as a bondmate. Each would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But something had changed. He no longer approached them with resistance. He approached them with curiosity. Because somewhere between the empathy of Lyra, the fire of Celestia, the intellect of Inari, and the diplomacy of Verelia, Chris had stopped trying to escape. He had begun to understand something deeper. True connection cannot be forced. But it can be cultivated. Not with law, but with effort. And perhaps, just perhaps, if he opened himself fully, this wasn't the loss of his freedom. It was the beginning of a different kind of power. The wind howled over the crystalline spires of the Elvenile estate, though there was no storm. The hum was artificial warning tones resonating through walls alive with memory. Red pulses of emergency light rippled through the palace like a heartbeat gone arrhythmic. Something was wrong. Something ancient, buried beneath layers of peace, had finally stirred. The heart device was destabilizing. Chris stood at the center of the command chamber, the pulsing core of the device flickering erratically behind translucent shielding. Its glow, once rhythmic and calm, now spasmed in bursts of violet and white. Instruments failed to stabilize it. Resonance lines frayed and snapped. The bond threads that connected him to the 7 sisters, so carefully woven through days of emotional communion, began to tremble under invisible strain. Then came the first impact. The estate shook. not like a tremor but like a warning from the stars themselves. The outer shields cracked under a focused beam of directed energy. The hegemony had come not with diplomacy, not with demands, but with annihilation. Celestia barked orders across the tactical interface, her fingers a blur over glowing controls. Serena triggered diversion frequencies through the gardens, sending sonic pulses designed to disorient incoming assault craft. Verillia summoned off-world allies with coded diplomatic beacons, while Inari rerouted the energy grid to prevent internal collapse. Chris moved instinctively not as Emperor, not as soldier, but as anchor. But when the second wave struck, this time breaching the upper towers, he felt it. A sharp severance. Lyra was no longer connected. She had run to the heart chamber, alone, trying to stabilize the device from its primary core. She had done it without telling anyone. Without asking for help. Because that was her way to carry the weight quietly, even if it broke her. Chris didn't hesitate. He tore through fire-slicked corridors, past fractured crystal and overturned walls. The estate groaned around him, every structure singing its pain in low harmonic tones. Outside, the sky was a battlefield, interceptor trails like falling stars, artillery flashes blooming like poisonous flowers in Laricia's violet clouds. But none of it mattered. Only one thing mattered. Lyra. He found her kneeling at the base of the heart device's open chamber, her arms extended toward it, her body shaking with strain. She was trying to harmonize with a machine designed to channel the energy of 8 souls, but she was alone, and breaking. Lyra, he shouted, but his voice barely reached her through the swirl of emotional energy around her. The device emitted a pulse so powerful it knocked him backward. The air was thick with static and the scent of ozone. The chamber shimmered like it existed between dimensions. He crawled forward. Another blast, this one external, ripped through the ceiling. A massive crystalline shard hurtled downward. Chris lunged, shoved Lyra aside, and was impaled. Pain bloomed across his side, searing white-hot. He dropped to his knees as the world blurred. Blood poured across the reflective floor, merging with the light. He heard Lyra scream his name, but what broke him wasn't the pain, it was the look in her eyes. Not fear. Not grief. But guilt. As if she had pulled the knife herself. The sisters arrived seconds later, each from a different corner of the estate. Mayuri, the eldest, froze when she saw them, Chris bleeding out, Lyra unconscious, and the heart device pulsing wildly in panic. The chamber's resonance field was collapsing. Inari's scan readings glitched. Serena wept silently. Verillia whispered diplomatic prayers. Celestia's hands trembled for the first time. Tyr said it first, the device won't activate. The harmony isn't complete. Mayuri's voice was iron. One of us hasn't joined the bond. They turned to her. She had been the wall, the last line of resistance. Throughout every session, she had kept herself emotionally guarded, believing her role was tradition, not vulnerability. But now the choice was hers. Not as eldest. Not as leader. But as sister. Chris coughed blood and looked up at her. I didn't ask for any of this, he whispered, but I chose all of you, anyway. And in that moment, perhaps because of pain, or perhaps because she finally saw him as more than fate's puppet, Mayuri stepped forward. She knelt, took his hand, and let go. All the walls, all the pride, all the fear. What flooded through the chamber wasn't just her emotion, it was her acceptance. Her trust. The one thing that had been missing. The heart device roared to life. Its core expanded, blossoming like a living star. Light poured from the crystal walls, igniting threads of energy that connected each sister, then lanced toward Chris's body, hovering between death and resurrection. The bond threads lit like constellations. And then, silence. Not absence but stillness. The kind of quiet that precedes transcendence. Chris felt his body lift, pain replaced by a warmth that wasn't heat but alignment. The sisters stood in a circle around him, their hearts synchronized in a harmonic pattern thousands of years old. Lyra's eyes fluttered open. Chris's wounds closed without stitches. The crystal embedded itself in his chest like a second heart. The device had been waiting. Not just for a bondmate, but for genuine harmony, not assigned, not accidental but chosen. And now, it had it. The palace walls no longer hummed with tension. The heart device had stabilized, its glow pulsing in perfect cadence with the emotional resonance of the 8 souls now bound to it. Chris felt different, stronger, calmer, but he couldn't explain why his dreams had become so loud. He heard voices in them now. Fragments of conversations, flashes of old memories that didn't feel entirely his. Images of Earth not as it was, but as it had been recorded, clinical, filtered, manipulated. Then came the message crystal. It appeared one morning without warning, floating from a sealed archive door within the diplomatic chamber. The door had no visible handle, no known access panel. Yet when Chris passed it, the walls pulsed violet, and a section of the crystal simply folded open, as if recognizing him. Inside was a single shimmering crystal, pale white, glowing faintly from within. Verolia was with him. She frowned. That archive's locked to blood access, only direct descendants of House Elvenile should be able to trigger it. But the crystal responded to his touch. It lifted into the air, rotated once, and activated. A hologram bloomed into being, 2 humans in expedition gear, standing in what looked like an underground Lorizian ruin. The man's voice trembled. "Chris, if you're seeing this, it means you've already found them. Or, they've found you." Chris staggered back. "Dad," he whispered. His father, Thomas Winters. And beside him his mother, Ellen. Archaeologists, or so he had believed. They had died in a cave-in during an off-world dig when he was 17. That had been the official story. The one the Federation wrote. But now, they stood here, preserved in light. "We weren't just researchers," his mother said. "We were part of a joint Earth-Lorizian initiative classified under the Celestial Bond Program. Long before official contact was made, covert negotiations had already begun. The Elvenile line needed a bridge, someone who could interface with their ancient device. Someone born of both worlds." Thomas nodded. "You, Chris. You were our contribution. Our hope. Your DNA was carefully designed. Your neural pathways, your emotional bandwidth, every part of you was selected for compatibility. You were meant to bond with one of them." His mother's voice broke. "But, no one expected you'd bond with all 7. The message ended. Silence fell like ash. Chris didn't move. Didn't speak. His knees weakened, and he sank onto the nearby bench, heart thudding beneath the embedded crystal in his chest. Verolia approached, slow and cautious. "You didn't know?" He shook his head. "I didn't even know they were still alive when they filmed that." Tyr confirmed the data signature. The message was authentic, years old, encoded to activate only when a unique genetic marker entered the room. His marker. The sisters gathered as the truth spread. Inari was the first to speak the unspoken. His genetic compatibility, it wasn't just high. It was engineered. Celestia stared at him with a mixture of awe and fury. "So you're not here by chance?" Mary's voice, colder than usual, "You were built for this." Lyra's silence was what hurt most. Not anger. Just silence. Chris stood, breathing hard, staring at the crystal walls as if they could reflect a truth that made sense. "What does that make me?" he asked aloud, not to anyone in particular. "A tool? A function? Was anything I've felt real?" Serena tried to answer, her voice gentle. "You felt them. You touched our minds. If you were faking that, the device would have rejected you." "But what if it was all coded into me?" he snapped. "What if every emotion was just pre-written programming waiting to be triggered by a violet-skinned woman with a tear in her eye?" He left. For hours, he wandered the outer chambers, ignoring the staff, ignoring the device's low whispers echoing in his veins. Everything inside him was a storm, a collision of doubt, betrayal, purpose, and isolation. He had always been alone. Even surrounded by light, by power, by destiny, he felt orphaned by design. And the heart device felt it too. It began to flicker again. Subtle at first. Then progressively unstable. Inari and Tyr scanned its frequencies. "The resonance is degrading," they said. "His emotional signal is fragmented. Dissonant. Without harmony, the system would collapse again. Not from attack. From within." Lyra found him sitting alone in the star observatory, an open dome with a view of Lauritia's twin moons bleeding violet light onto the sea. She approached in silence, then sat beside him. "I'm not mad," she said, voice soft. "I'm just hurting. You were supposed to be ours. And now I don't know if you were ever yours." Chris laughed without humor. "That makes two of us." Lyra reached out, not to take his hand, but to place hers beside his. Close. Equal. Not forcing the bond, offering it. "I don't care why you were created. I only care what you choose now." Chris stared at her. She didn't glow like prophecy. She didn't carry the weight of fate in her shoulders. She just looked tired. Brave. Honest. And in that moment, the layers broke. Not the ones in the device. The ones in him. He let go. Let the pain rise, the fear swell, the love he'd buried pulse upward. And for the first time, the bond between them shimmered, not because it was designed to, but because he gave it permission. The heart device pulsed again, clean, whole, alive. He felt the sisters react across the estate, sensing not his perfection, but his choice. And for the first time since learning the truth, Chris felt like more than a vessel. He felt human. He felt real. He felt ready. Chris floated in darkness. No breath, no heartbeat, no body, just the echo of a decision that had not yet been made. The world around him did not exist in any physical form. There was no floor, no ceiling, no light, yet everything shimmered with a strange rhythm, like reality was breathing around him. Then came the pulse. Thump. 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 It was not his own. It was something older. Something buried in the architecture of the universe. A rhythm that had been waiting for his soul to crack open. From that void, a shape emerged, not a person, not a machine, but an intelligence. The presence of the heart device itself. Its voice was neither male nor female, neither kind nor cruel. It simply was. "Christopher Winters. You stand at the threshold." Chris tried to speak but had no mouth, no lungs. He formed the thought instead, am I dead? Not yet. But your body fails. Lioraz does too. You have reached the convergence where destiny and will collide. Then the void shifted, and in a moment that had no time, he saw everything. Lioraz's broken body lying beside his own. Her silver eyes dimming, her blood mixing with his. The sisters standing around them, powerless. The heart device flickering as if awaiting one final command. Chris drifted above it all, watching his own mortality play out below him like a forgotten chapter still unfinished. The voice returned. Two paths remain. A wave of energy shimmered before him. Two images coalesced, one a star fading into black. The other a human figure glowing with violet light, heart exposed, skin changed, something no longer entirely earthborn. Refuse the bond. You and Lyra die. The device goes dormant. The galaxy spirals into conflict. Accept the bond. You synchronize permanently. Your humanity dissolves. You become the Heart Emperor not as symbol, but as vessel. As conductor. As gatekeeper. Chris felt no judgment in the voice. Only truth. Then came the whisper he didn't expect. But it must be your choice. And that was the knife. Because now, stripped of illusion, stripped of even flesh, Chris saw the core question of his existence not as a prophecy, not as a mission but as a test of what it meant to be alive. He saw his childhood, the long nights alone while his parents researched. The loneliness of deep space halls, the silent cockpits filled only with music and regret. The feeling that he was always waiting for something to find him. He saw Lyra, not as a destiny, but as a moment. As the moment. She had looked at him with wonder when he lifted that beam. She had kissed him not because of protocol, but because she saw in him something real. Not a construct. Not a key. Just Chris. And then, suddenly, it wasn't about being a chosen one. It wasn't about the war. Or the prophecy. Or the council. It was about her hand in his. About his blood in her name. About wanting to live not for power, but for love. Chris turned to the presence. I choose life. Not because I was built for it. But because I want to live long enough to choose her. Again. And again. The heart device shuddered. Not in rejection. In revelation. Very well, Christopher Winters. Synchronization initiated. Identity preserved. Purpose aligned. Then the pain came. It was not pain like fire or knives. It was a transformation of definition. He felt every atom in his body ripple, dissolve, reconfigure. His DNA rewrote itself, absorbing centuries of Lorizian resonance. His bones vibrated with frequencies used only in celestial harmonics. His mind opened and kept opening until he felt the emotional signatures of thousands, millions, like stars mapped across his nervous system. He screamed, but the sound echoed as light. His form reassembled. His heart became to his own, and the crystalline core now embedded in his chest, beating with a harmony that spanned entire constellations. His eyes opened. Not in the void, but on the floor of the heart chamber. The sisters knelt around him, their faces soaked in emotion. Lyra was beside him, pale, unmoving. Chris reached out, his fingers trembling, but glowing faintly with the heart device's essence, and placed his palm over her heart. Come back, he whispered. You're the reason I chose. And the light surged. A wave of raw empathic energy shot from his chest, flooding into hers. Her body convulsed, arched, and then Lyra gasped. Her silver eyes opened, wide with shock, then soft with recognition. She looked at him as though seeing not a god, but a man who had chosen her, even in death. And as the chamber's walls pulsed in time with their hearts, Chris whispered, not to the device, not to the sisters, but to himself. I am not just what they made me. I am what I choose to love. And the device, for the first time, felt joy. Chris awoke to silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the kind that waits. The kind that listens. He opened his eyes and saw the heart chamber bathed in an ambient violet light, soft, pulsing, alive. He lay not on a bed, but upon a suspended platform woven from threads of light and crystal, like the womb of a star. His body wasn't what it had been. He sat up. His skin shimmered subtly, a translucent sheen overlaying the familiar human tone. His chest bore the crystalline sigil of the heart device, now fused seamlessly into his biology, its pulse perfectly synchronized with his own heartbeat. But more than the changes outside was the truth within. He could feel them. Not just the sisters, who stood in quiet awe around him. Not just Lyra, whose emotions trembled like wind across a lake. No, he felt the entire city, and then, expanding outward, the continent, the planet, and beyond. Millions of emotional threads weaving through his perception like a living tapestry. Fear. Relief. Sorrow. Wonder. All distinct. All real. He could taste the grief of a child who'd lost a parent in the recent battle. He could hear the private guilt of a soldier who had followed orders too long. He could sense the joy of two lovers reunited in the eastern spires, and the shame of a diplomat hiding a truth that no longer served peace. Chris had become more than a man. He had become an empathic conductor, a nexus through which every emotional frequency on Lorizian could resonate. And in the far distance, like a smudge of oil on still water, he felt the hegemony. Their warships still lingered, circling the planet like scavengers, waiting for weakness. But what pulsed through them wasn't just strategy or hatred. It was manipulation, emotional suppression, control, behavioral overrides. Their soldiers were not entirely themselves. Their rage was synthetic. Their loyalty chemically enforced. Chris stood, and when he did, the air around him shifted gently, reverently. The walls of the heart chamber expanded, revealing the full council dome. The sisters followed in silence as he walked toward the central platform, where defense screens now showed a full display of the enemy fleet poised in orbit. Celestia moved beside him. We're outnumbered. They'll land within the hour. Chris shook his head. They won't. His hand touched the heart crystal in his chest. For a moment, the pulse grew quiet, then surged outward. And every ship in orbit felt it. The hegemony captains staggered as their interface systems shorted. Neural conditioners sparked, their feedback loops overwhelmed. Across the command centers of those vessels, soldiers collapsed not in pain, but in awakening. The artificial emotional matrices that had shaped their behavior dissolved like fog under sunlight. And then the screaming started, not from physical agony, but from remembrance. Remorse. Clarity. Horror. The soldiers felt the weight of their actions. The manipulated fury they had been fed for years broke, revealing the fragile truth beneath. On the surface, the palace shook not from weapons but from what poured down from orbit. Surrender pods. Hundreds. Then thousands. Unarmed soldiers disembarking with hands raised, eyes wide, and souls shattered open by the return of their own emotions. Lyra approached Chris, trembling. What did you do? He turned to her not as a weapon, not as a chosen one, but as something rarer, a mirror of the galaxy's heart. I didn't defeat them, he said softly. I gave them back what was stolen. Verelia watched as the orbital fleets powered down, their lights dimming one by one. This wasn't war. This was liberation. Chris nodded. Empathy had become a force stronger than fire. Not a shield. Not a sword. But a release. Inari stepped closer, scanning the residual waves emanating from Chris's body. The frequency you broadcasted matches a forgotten sequence in the device's oldest core. A wavelength never used before. Chris looked down at his hands. They called it a weapon, he murmured. But it was always meant to be a cure. Then the chamber shifted again, and holograms from around the world lit the air. Peace envoys. Planetary leaders. Alien scientists. All watching. All speaking his name. Not as a man. Not as a myth. But as something new. The Heart Emperor. And for the first time in recorded history, a world had not been saved by power, by rule, or by blood, but by the one force most civilizations had forgotten how to wield. Empathy. The sea beneath the crystalline estate shimmered like a pulse, alive, reflective, vast. Above it, in the spires of Larishia's newly reformed central chamber, the heart device hovered silently in the chest of its new sovereign, radiating not power, but purpose. Not domination, but unity. Chris stood before the grand round table of crystal and energy, surrounded by the 7 daughters of House Elvenile, no longer just princesses, but architects of something the galaxy had never seen before. An empire of empathy. It was Verelia who had first proposed it, not with fanfare, but with vision. If we do nothing, she had said, they will appoint another emperor. Another council. Another war will rise. We must not just end the system. We must replace it with something better. Each sister brought forth her domain. Celestia, unbending and sharp, assumed command of planetary defense, not to expand through conquest, but to guard without fear. I will train guardians, not soldiers, she vowed. Empathy is not weakness, but it still needs a shield. Inari, whose analytical mind never stopped dissecting the resonance of the heart device, became head of the Scientific and Healing Directorate. Her labs would open to species across systems, and her goal was clear: to map every emotional frequency the device can detect. To understand pain before we try to erase it. Tyar took intelligence quietly, efficiently. She did not trust peace unless it was observable, measurable. Her emotion maps became predictive models, able to foresee the rise of extremist ideologies before they could metastasize. My task, she said simply, is vigilance through empathy. Serena, luminous as always, stood at the helm of cultural diplomacy. Her performances would become more than art, they would become broadcasts that healed, educated, and connected. We must not only speak, she declared, we must be felt. Verelia, poised and resolute, retained the diplomatic seat, becoming the voice of Laricia before the Galactic Council. But now she spoke not only as a negotiator, but as the conscience of a movement. Her words disarmed empires and soothed old grudges. Mayuri, once the most distant, now sat as high strategist and inner council guide, tasked with reminding them all of consequences. Even empathy can be corrupted by ego, she warned. I will not let us forget who we serve, not ourselves, but the hearts of many. And Lyra remained by Chris's side, not as his advisor, nor even as a leader of a domain, but as his anchor. She had refused formal office, instead choosing to become the voice within the heart device itself, monitoring suffering, healing silently, day and night. Her connection to Chris had become something beyond ritual. It had become voluntary resonance. He loved her. Openly. Clearly. Without confusion. Though he was bonded to Seven, it was with Lyra that his soul had first aligned. In her presence, the heart device burned more steadily. She had been his beginning not because the kiss was magical, but because the moment was honest. One night, beneath the twin moons, Chris found her in the gardens where they had first harmonized. The crystals shimmered in slow, circular patterns echoing peace. "Why me?" he asked. She turned, her silver eyes glistening, but calm. "Because you didn't want to be emperor." He laughed softly. "That makes me qualified." "It makes you human," she whispered. "And we needed something more than divine. We needed real." Chris reached for her hand not because the bond demanded it, but because he did. Through the link, emotions flowed, no longer overwhelming. Just present. Alive. And in that moment, the foundations of the new empire were not drawn by laws or treaties. They were felt. By every species who tuned into the heart broadcast. By every child raised in cities where fear was no longer the first lesson. By those who once believed power must come from strength, now witnessing it emerge from understanding. This was not an empire built of weapons. It was an empire built of wounds that had learned how to heal. Not ruled by a god, but led by a man who had chosen again and again to feel. The crystal gardens were blooming in frequencies no one had ever recorded before. Not colors. Not scents. But emotions pulsing from the crystalline flora in soft, cyclical rhythms. Joy. Expectation. Wonder. The very structure of the garden had begun reacting to a presence yet to be born. Lyra stood at its center, her hand resting on her stomach. Her skin shimmered slightly in the twilight, and the embedded heart crystal in Chris's chest pulsed in sync with her every breath. But the resonance between them wasn't two-way anymore. It was three. The child had begun broadcasting. Faint. Incomplete. Unformed. But unmistakable. Chris could feel it even before he stepped into the garden, like a distant musical note just beginning to form harmony, not yet melody. He approached her slowly, reverently, as if proximity might disturb the fragile frequency. She turned to him, eyes glowing with more than light. "He feels everything already," she whispered. "Even now. Even here." Chris stared at her in awe. "Then he's not like us." "No," she said. "He's the next." Inari had been the first to detect it. Genetic sequencing from a single blood sample revealed an architecture neither fully human nor entirely Lorizian. It was not just a fusion, it was a mutation, a synthesis that went beyond both species. Empathic receptors are forming in neural tissue before structural cognition, Inari had said, astonished. "That's biologically impossible. Emotion is supposed to be learned." "But for him," Lyra replied, "emotion will be inherent." Serena wrote a song about it. Of course she did. She called it "The First Light Doesn't Ask Permission." It was performed that evening in the inner dome of the palace, accompanied by sound frequencies tuned to the unborn child's emotional output. The room shimmered as if time itself paused to listen. The Galactic Council responded days later. Not with hostility or fear, but with something rarer. Curiosity. And caution. Delegates arrived to witness the child firsthand, not for political inspection, but because no one had ever seen the future form like this. Not in real time. not in a womb woven of love, purpose, and harmonized bloodlines. Tyr developed a containment field not to restrict the child, but to ensure that the empathic emissions didn't overload nearby species. He's broadcasting without control, she explained. And he's not even born yet. If this continues unchecked, we may be looking at the birth of a collective conduit. Mayuri, usually measured and silent, said it more bluntly, he may not be just a child. He may be the key to ending species-level isolation. But to Chris, he wasn't prophecy. He wasn't a bridge, or a solution, or an evolution. He was his son. And in the quiet nights, when the palace dimmed and the galaxy turned slowly outside the transparent ceilings, Chris would lie beside Lyra, hand over her heart, and listen not with ears, not even with empathy but with the part of him that had once been human. The part that still marveled at every breath. Every pulse of life that hadn't been designed. That had chosen to come into being. Because this child had not been created in a lab. Not programmed by governments. Not engineered in hidden chambers. This child was born of a kiss in chaos. Of blood spilled not for glory, but for rescue. He was the child of two worlds, but more than that, he was a child of a future that had once been impossible. No longer just a symbol. But the first proof that peace doesn't have to be taught. It can be inherited. The galaxy didn't remember the name of the cargo ship. Not the day it landed. Not the registry. Not even the route number. But it remembered the man who stepped off it. Chris Winters, once just a name stamped on forgotten freight logs, was now recorded in every living archive of the Galactic Council. Not as a warrior. Not as a ruler. But as something rarer, a soul who dared to choose differently when the moment arrived. In the early days, many still called him a fluke. An accident. A human bonded to alien royalty through a ritual misunderstood, elevated by circumstance. But history had its own way of testing such stories. And Chris passed every one of those trials not through dominance, but by refusing to become what the galaxy expected. He never claimed a throne. He walked among the people, even when his skin shimmered with crystalline resonance and the heart device glowed through his chest like a second sun. He spoke not with proclamations, but with presence. When he entered a refugee dome, the air changed not because of fear, but because he could feel what no one else dared to say aloud. Grief. Shame. Hope. Longing. He carried them all and then returned them to their owners, softened, acknowledged, never dismissed. The sisters became legends too, each one carving new pillars of what an interstellar society could be. Verulia redrew the diplomatic language of 4-star systems. Celestia built peacekeeping squadrons that had never fired a weapon. Inaries' discoveries on emotional resonance reshaped the way species approached healing. Tyr created the galaxy's first empathic crisis detection web. Serena's performances became cultural bridges. Mayuri rewrote war protocols into empathy codes. And Lyra gave birth to the future. The child, born in a dome flooded with violet light, arrived not with cries, but with stillness so profound that every being in the palace paused, their hearts briefly sinking with something beyond words. He didn't speak until his second year, but by then, he had already connected with dozens of minds, soothed grief, and once, stopped a riot with nothing but a touch. But Chris remained the center not because he held the most power, but because he was the first to say no to it. He never raised a flag. Never built a palace in his name. He lived among the archives, among the people, among his family. And yet, when chaos once again threatened the rim systems, and a faction of cold logic-driven species declared empathy inefficient, sabotaging harmonization satellites and replacing them with emotion blockers. It was Chris they summoned. Not with summons of force, but with a song. A resonance beacon, tuned to the first frequency he had ever emitted when he became the Heart Emperor. He answered. He stood before them not with threats but with his story. He spoke of a beam falling in a spaceport, of a stranger with silver eyes, of a kiss that changed nothing but revealed everything. And then he opened his chest, placed his hand over the crystal embedded in his body, and let them feel. Not theory, not weaponized compassion. Real, unfiltered, collective emotion. For 3 days, the rebels said nothing. On the 4th, they deactivated their blockers and asked for harmonization training. And once again, the galaxy remembered. Not the empire, not the crown, but the man who once lifted a stranger from the rubble and chose to love, again and again, despite the weight of destiny pressing on his shoulders. The legends call him the living heart. But to those who knew him, Lyra, the sisters, the child, the people in the streets, he was still just Chris. The pilot who delivered more than cargo. He delivered hope. And proved that sometimes, the ones least prepared for greatness are the ones who carry it best. From a quiet man hauling forgotten freight, to the living bridge of a new galactic age, Chris didn't rise because of power or prophecy. He became a legend because he chose to feel, to protect, to love again and again. But what does that choice mean to you? If you were in Chris's place, would you accept the burden of becoming the Heart Emperor? Could you love all 7 and still know who you are? Or would you walk away from destiny, to remain human? Let us know which moment in this story touched you the most. If you could inherit just one of the sisters' abilities, whose path would you walk? And if you believe empathy is the true force of change, then join us, and subscribe to the Alien Storyverse, where cosmic tales aren't just entertainment. They're reflections of who we might become. The galaxy is listening. What will your story be?